All right, folks, we're going to do the review of Chapter 4, Drugs and Crime. Now, this chapter's got a lot of good information in it. It's pretty heavy on ideas, on theories, on explanations. So pay particularly close attention to this because it helps kind of make sense of a lot of the other material from the other chapters. But since it's sort of the focus is a lot on theory, I don't think it'll take us that long to summarize it in these lecture segments. But make sure on your own that you cover the chapter carefully as well. Okay, let's jump in. Really a key question in the study of drugs and crime is the relationship between the two. We see here in this highlighted point the causal relationship between drugs and crime. So there's, if you've studied their research methods much, and you're looking at the relationship between two variables, say x and y, the variables drugs could cause crime, drugs could lead to crime, and we'll get into why. Crime could lead to drugs, and we'll get into why. The relationship could be reciprocal, meaning that the drugs could lead to crime, which could lead to more drugs, which could lead to more crime. So it goes around like in a circle. That's what they mean by reciprocal, it goes round and around. Or it could be that if someone is using a lot of drugs and also committing a lot of crimes, it could be that there's some other factor that's causing both of those things. So say, for example, you belong to a gang. That gang might be encouraging you to party and to use illicit drugs. Even if you're not into it that much, you still might get encouraged to use those a lot on the one hand, and also on the other hand, you could be encouraged to commit crimes or pushed or pressured into commit crimes. So it could be something like the gang, for example, that could be explaining both drug use and criminal behavior. And it doesn't even have to be like a hardened official organized gang. It could be a group of friends, of peers who are prone to both of those things, prone to drugs. Drugs are usually used in a social context. So you could be hanging out with friends who like to use drugs, and they also may be inclined to commit crimes, and because of their influence on you, you commit crimes too. See, so that's a third factor, the influence of peers, of friends, of the gang. So there's lots of possibilities here what the relationship is between drugs and crime. So we're going to discuss this is kind of the center of this chapter. Now, they've got a couple of definitions. If I don't cover any from this chapter, make sure that you do it on your own. Drug-defined crimes are violations of laws prohibiting the possession, so having drugs, distributing, moving drugs around, or manufacture, making drugs of specific drugs, specific quantities of drugs. Okay, so this is the broad term, drug-defined crimes. These are crimes that involve all the different things that you could be doing with drugs. And so it's a broad sort of category. And of course, we know that there are illicit drugs that are illegal to be distributing, to be selling, to be making, to be holding on to in possession of. Now, one thing that I neglected to do because of time in the last chapter was to go over in detail the Schedule 1 drugs. So make sure, if you haven't done that already, that you're going over that carefully, because that's something that comes up in the discussion again and again in various chapters. So offenses including the Schedule 1 controlled substances, which are regarded as having the greatest potential for abuse and with no accepted medical use. So that's what they think of when they determine what Schedule 1 is. Is it something that people abuse a lot? Is the type of drug that people abuse a lot? And also, is there any acceptable medical use of this drug? Yes or no, or to what extent? So those drugs that are seen as being the most harmful with no benefit are usually carry the most severe penalties when we're talking about these drug-defined crimes. So it boils down to most of these, what we think of with these illegal street drugs that we're going to be talking about throughout the semester. Of course, the one that traditionally has been a Schedule 1 drug, which has been controversial to have it Schedule 1, has been marijuana, because there's plenty of evidence that marijuana is not does not have as much potential for abuse, for addiction, as some of the harder Schedule 1 drugs like cocaine and heroin and meth, that sort of stuff. And that also there's evidence that there are some medicinal uses of marijuana which are on the positive side. So that's one of the traditionally controversial drugs that's traditionally been a Schedule 1 drug, but more about that later. Now, I pulled up the one problem with our textbook is that the stats are, always dated. Now, sometimes that's not important. It doesn't take away from the essential points we're trying to make. Sometimes it does. But I pulled up the newest that I could find FBI statistics. So here we're talking about the national level for the entire United States. And here we have the numbers. I believe it's for, I wish I would have pulled up the year, but it's the newest year that I could find. Might have been 2022. Anyway, they don't fluctuate too much from year to year. And here you have the arrests for different types of offenses. And you can see if we go down to what's relevant for this course, drug abuse violations. So here we're talking about kind of everything. About 700 to round here, 767,000 people in the United States were arrested for some drug abuse violation. So that's including lots of different things, as you'll see. Now, just to compare that, if for some reference here, some context, compare it with simple assault. Simple assault is a minor assault where somebody threatens somebody else, threatens their life, or maybe there's a scuffle, there's some violence, some actual physical violence, but it's minor, nobody really gets hurt, at least in any serious way. Well, people getting arrested for that crime happened about 800,000 times in a year. And so you can see that all different types of drug violations amounts to close to the same number, a little bit less than the simple assault. So you can, always think of it this way, that the more serious the crime, the less it tends to happen. The less serious the crime, the more commonly you see it. That's a pretty hard rule in criminology. So you can see here that assault, which is a more serious crime, is arrested a little bit more than drug violations, but not a lot more than drug violations. So that gives some context that up against a crime that's a little more, well, it depends on which type of crime you're talking about. Big time drug dealing is very serious too. But as class of categories of crimes, you can see that drug abuse violations are getting arrested in the neighborhood of, similar to minor violence. Not serious violence, but minor violence. Now, you can see as we go down further that most of these drug abuse violations, these arrests, which again are about 767,000, most of those, 673,000, are for possession. So you've got some drugs on your person, maybe in your car, and so you get arrested for those drugs. And so that's the most common scenario for when you get arrested for some sort of drug violation. Now, driving under the influence is considered, that's like a different sort of category here. There we're talking, driving under the influence of typically alcohol. And so that's, you can see here that in and of itself is a common crime for which people are arrested, about 652,000. And of course, that's relevant in this course because alcohol is a drug. It's a legal drug for people of age, but that doesn't mean it's not tied up in problematic or illegal or criminal behavior. It often is. Alcohol is tied up with a lot of criminal behavior. And you can see driving under the influence, these folks have been abused, have been drinking and driving. And so we're talking, that's a common sort of offense for which people are arrested as well. So again, one of the big stories here is that most of the time if you get arrested for drugs, it's going to be for possession. Now let's move to the next table that, again, this is pulled from FBI's website. Now when we're talking about drug sales or manufacturing, now you're talking a little under 100,000. So it's just a chunk. And I've got a statistic lower on here, lower below. it's a minority of the drug arrests are for sales or for manufacturing. And again, you would expect that because the more serious the crime, the less the people get arrested for it. Possession, less serious, more people getting arrested. Sales, manufacturing, more serious, fewer people arrested, less than 100,000. Still a significant number, but a lot smaller than that total drug abuse violation that we saw up above. Now, if you're talking about other drug abuse violations, specific counts, here you have other dangerous non-narcotic drugs. It's about 36,000 people arrested for those. And this is sales. This is the sales and manufacturing. So they're just breaking down the types of drugs here. So for your opium and your cocaine, rounding 34,000. For marijuana, not so much, even though that's a more common drug, a more commonly used drug, less arrests for making or selling that, about 19,000. Synthetic lab-made narcotics, not too many, roughly 5,000. So you got some sort of, some of these are pretty rough categories. Got a lot of different types of drugs in there, but at least gives you some sense of the arrests that are going on in the United States for sales and manufacturing. Again, I would say big picture is that most of the time you get arrested, it's for possession. And if you do get arrested for sales and manufacturing, most of the time it is not marijuana that you're getting arrested for sales and manufacturing. It's something more serious, a more serious type of drug is more often are people arrested for sales and manufacturing. So you can see there's some sort of, so even though there's a lot of marijuana out there, the priority of the criminal justice system tends to be to go after the people who are manufacturing or selling more dangerous drugs, more addictive, more harmful, like meth, for example, or heroin, for example. The criminal justice, you can kind of a couple rules of thumb for the criminal justice system. It tends to go after what's most serious. That's a tendency, not always, but that's a tendency to go after what's most serious, to devote resources, time, energies to more serious, but also to devote time and energy and resources on what's the easiest to apprehend. So if you've got young people out on the street corner in obvious places selling drugs out in the open, those folks are easy to target and arrest compared to people who are engaging in sales and purchases of drugs behind closed doors in somebody's apartment or somebody's house, hidden where it's not seen in public. So law enforcement is going to tend to target those people out on the street corner because they're easier to get. And so they want success, and so they go for ease of arrest where they can catch people breaking the law, but they also tend to prioritize the more serious over the less serious as well. Those are just two. It's not always the case, but those are strong tendencies you see in the criminal justice system. Now, drug abuse violations, as defined by FBI, we just went over those FBI numbers, include offenses related to unlawful possession, use, sale, or distribution of controlled substances. Slightly different definition than what we saw before, in that they specifically list sales here along with the other stuff, and also use. That earlier definition was focusing more on distribution, manufacture, less on the other ones. Anyway, so the focus here is FBI. Now, here's an important stat that doesn't come from the textbook. By the way, everything I've been going over stats-wise has not been textbook data. It's been newer FBI data because I try to stay as updated as possible. So about 12% of, so everybody who's getting arrested for something drug-related, about 12% of them are getting arrested for selling the drug, manufacturing the drug. Again, so the rest of those, the bulk, is going to be for possession. 12% of the arrests for sales and manufacturing. Now, according to another federal agency called the Bureau of Justice Statistics, or BJS, in 2019, newest numbers I could find, out of about 1.6 million drug-related arrests, 24% resulted in incarceration. Now, what can we draw a couple of rough conclusions from these numbers? What it tells us is that most of the time, all these hundreds of thousands of people who are getting arrested for drugs, and it's usually possession, most of the time they don't end up incarcerated for it. They don't end up in jail. They don't end up in prison. Most of the time, only 24% of the time are they spending some time behind bars. So most of the time, these people who are getting arrested for possession does not result in an incarceration. 24% of the time it does. But keep in mind that 12%, we just went over how 12% of these arrests are for sales and manufacturing, and those people are likely to be incarcerated, the people involved in sales and manufacturing. So this 24% who end up in jail or prison, a lot of those folks are people who were arrested for selling, for manufacture. A lot of those folks. So what you see is you see a lot of the people arrested for possession, not locked up, not in jail or prison. A lot of the people who are locked up are people who were originally arrested for sales or manufacturing. So again, that gives us a little bit of context, and I think one thing that it does, it gives a little context when the image out there is sometimes we get the message that, you know, these jails and prisons are filled with people who did nothing but were in possession, maybe possession of small amounts of some sort of illegal substance, and that got them a prison sentence or something like that. That's really not, you got to put that in perspective. Yes, you get some cases of that, but most of the time, people who end up behind bars, especially a prison and long-term sentence, these are people who've been arrested, convicted of sales, because again, that's what the criminal justice system tends to prioritize, the bigger crimes, the sales, the manufacturing, as opposed to just being in possession of the drug. Let's stop there. We'll continue on in part 2.